Have you ever wondered what goes into making the products we use every day safer for our health and the environment? Today, we dive into the transformative journey of substituting hazardous substances with safer alternatives. Together with Beth Uhlhorn from Dow and Pam Eliason from TURI, we will explore strategies that ensure regulatory compliance and also drive sustainability and innovation, since there is a need for speed in relation to substitution. Ladies, why is there an increasing need for substitution of hazardous materials in society and industry today?
Thanks, Tjeerd. Sure, I can start. I would say from an industry perspective and from a company perspective, industries and companies are interested in having a good reputation, in having trust from society, from regulators, all of those sorts of things. And so looking to identify substitutes for things that are of concern or to develop safer chemistry is a way that you can really demonstrate to society, create trust in society and show progress, and that you're moving away from materials that they're worried about.
Okay, and Pam?
I think, we're learning so much more about chemicals and materials and their potential to have a negative impact on humans or on the environment. And as we learn more, I think there's a real opportunity there to question, do we just accept that, or do we innovate? Do we find new ways to do what we do that are safer and more sustainable so that we don't have to go through the process again? So I think we're learning more, and I think companies also have more of a commitment to making a change and being in the game for the long term. And you can't do that if you're using something that's harming the environment or your workers or the general population.
Wonderful phrase. Pam, TURI, Massachusetts Toxic Use Reduction Institute, is already successfully supporting companies for more than 3 decades with substitution. How come at the moment there's an increasing need for substitution?
Well, I think there's always a need for substitution, and there's a need to go beyond substitution. Often we can find a safer chemical, sometimes we can't. And so really helping companies to think through the problem more holistically, and also to recognize that it's not just about substitution, it's about looking at how can we do our process, run our operation more efficiently, and how can we design our products so that they don't contain hazardous chemicals in the first place. These are all pieces of a strategy that companies can and do use in Massachusetts and can do elsewhere. Tjeerd, I understand that there's a need for substitution in the European Union as well. Why don't you tell me a little bit more about what's happening there?
You're absolutely right, Pam. The European Parliament has shown significant interest in promoting the substitution of hazardous chemicals, and they have requested DG GROW to set up and test an EU substitution center or even a network of substitution centers to provide support to businesses, SMEs sometimes, to substitute their use of hazardous chemicals through collaboration, innovation, research and direct assistance. This substitution center and all their services will be tested in a few pilot projects. Among others, there's a pilot project focusing on the substitution of chromium-6 substances in hard chrome plating. And my Haskoning team, together with our partner EPA, is currently exploring how to organize the PFAS substitution in the battery value chain. So we're really up to speed in Europe considering substitution. If we would have such a substitution center, Beth, what kind of services would industry expect from a substitution center so that it's useful for you?
Yeah, that sounds really cool. And I could think of a few things that I would like to see in a substitution center. One, I know this is kind of something that we're starting to hear more and more about, but leaning into AI creation of safer molecules, that would be something that a substitution center could do. Also, taking it maybe from that model stage into early proof of concept, depending on the resources that a substitution center would have. So early proof of concept, so that then chemical companies like ours could take it to scale, because obviously that's what we do best, right? And then I could also see something along the lines of standard setting in certain areas. Like you're talking about PFAS replacements, but maybe it would also be around like what would a safer alternative in the battery space look like? So what actually are you looking for? Because you need an element of persistence in order to work in terms of durability. So what does it mean to actually be safer in that sort of context? And then I could also see them hosting various collaborations, and I think you touched on this a little bit. So a couple of ways, value chain collaborations where you bring together kind of value chain partners to look at solutions, like you mentioned with the battery value chain, for example. Or it could be something with, say, maybe a company and academia or something like that, who could then look at a problem holistically and maybe develop solutions and kind of get to that early proof of concept stage. Okay. So lots of services that I could see a substitution center delivering.
Just to clarify, in our project, we're not substituting PFAS in the battery value chain. We're trying in the pilot project to organize, so see what is needed to substitute. And for that, Pam, decades of experiences at TURI. So what kind of services do you provide?
Well, we provide a lot of the services that Beth just mentioned. So, come on down. Yeah. We work with academia to do research, to do entry-level research to understand the problem and to understand the potential for opportunities. We have a lot of great examples around the research. We provide the support for companies who are considering implementing changes in their processes and need to really be able to convince themselves and their peers that it works. I think one of the most important things that we do is we work with a whole cohort of professionals, training them in the process of really systematically looking at why they're using those toxic chemicals, where their opportunities lie, and how they can assess whether or not an opportunity to change is something that's really feasible for their facilities. So we provide those kinds of services, and it's been very successful over the last 30 plus years.
Great. Beth, it's 2025. Yeah. In Dow's 2025 sustainability goals, a few more months left, Dow made a commitment to accelerate your safer material journey through innovation, candid conversations, and open and transparent chemistry. Can you tell us a little bit about that journey?
Yeah, so thank you for asking. It's really very timely. As you noted, it is 2025, and so we're wrapping up that goal. And, it's a 10-year goal, right? And I feel like we learned so much along the way. I want to start with talking about some of the things that we put out there. So you mentioned open and transparent chemistry and the need for collaboration in the space. One of the things that came out of this was we created what we call a blueprint for product safety. And that's really not just how we practice product safety, but also how we believe that it should be practiced in the industry. So it's setting the blueprint for the whole of industry. And it includes things like the way that our in-house toxicology lab interacts with R&D and how we, when a new molecule is developed, how the toxicology group gets involved and evaluates the hazards. And we have this fun little video created. I would encourage anyone to go visit our website and see the fun little video where it has the molecule various molecules being evaluated, and then it's like, no, you're not good enough, and that kind of thing. So we put out that piece about the engagement, but then also a number of collaborations and publications that we did through collaboration. So everything from research on non-animal testing methods to innovation in the predictive toxicology space. So this blueprint, it's a living space, and we continue to add to it. And it sort of shows how, look, product safety it's not just one thing, it's executing and continuing to grow and improve in all of these areas. And so that's really been an important part of that goal. And then the second piece of the goal that I think is really interesting is kind of the core of the goal. We said we would develop 10 sustainable alternatives. And that term sustainable is really what has been interesting, because we said not just safer. It wasn't just the removal of a hazard or improvement in the hazard profile. These alternatives also had to deliver an improved LCA relative to whatever we were comparing it to. And then they also had to show profitability or strong enough sales that we believe that this was a good candidate for true sustainable growth, right? And at the beginning of the goal, I remember thinking, oh my gosh, 10 is going to be so easy. And it was actually quite a challenge to find 10 new molecules that hit all of those parameters, because a lot of what we found were that there actually are trade-offs. And so things, a really good example from history is the development of low VOC paint, right? So in making paint much safer, we moved from solvents to water. And so water-based paint, right? But in doing that, you use more water and you use more energy in making that paint than relative to the alternative. Unquestionably a better decision for, particularly professional painters' health, right? So unquestionably the right decision, but then you've still got to work on those other two pieces because there were trade-offs to that. And that was what we found in a number of our inherently safer solutions, was that then we also had to work on the other components of that LCA. Or we found that we had to give them time to get to the point of market success where we could count them and feel confident that they would still be around as long-term products with profitability, viability.
Okay, perfect. What do you consider are the key principles for a safer material strategy?
Yeah, so it's those same things that we talked about in that goal that we set 10 years ago. Candid conversations, open and transparent, transparency, openness, and then innovation, right? And I would say even more broadly than just innovation, science overall. So as we've kind of bridged from that 10-year goal now into a broader, safer materials strategy, we're looking to continue and improve in terms of transparency. And we really want to lean into those candid conversations as well. We believe that, look, things get better in talking to people who you might not fully agree with. And it's really great to see scientists come together from, regulators and Dow, or NGOs and Dow, and look at some of these challenges and evaluate them and come to a decision together. So I think that piece on collaboration and on candid conversations is really important.
Okay, thank you for sharing this journey of a decade.
Yeah.
Pam, TURI, for over 3 decades, is helping companies, a lot of SMEs. What are the challenges they face when implementing a safer materials strategy?
So the first reaction in this whole process is we're not going to be able to afford it. So especially SMEs, as you say, are concerned about the affordability of making a change to their production process or to their product or to the chemicals that they're using. But we have found that safer materials, safer processes actually have trade-offs that can improve the overall economic benefit of making the change. So that, in my experience, is less of a concern than really being able to accept performance that is maybe outside of the parameters of the chemical that they're used to using. So for example, you have methylene chloride, and it can, successfully put into solution a wide range of materials. If you can only accept a chemical substitute that can do the full range identically, you are limited. You are unlikely to find a solution. So helping companies to really think about, is the performance that I demand this right now what I need, or is there something that maybe is a little bit broader that is still very sufficient to meet the needs of our customers? So helping companies to kind of expand the parameters around which they're willing to play, I think is really important. And then helping them to really understand, how do you know if something is in fact safer? All of this is important, particularly as companies recognize that they want to, if they're going to have to make a change, if there's a regulation or a restriction, they want to be able to rely on the change they make being something that will sustain their business for the long term. So it's challenging. There's a lot that goes into it, and we do our best to help companies really, really evaluate their opportunities broadly.
And you indicate we do our best. And what I think is so nice at TURI, they have the so-called toxic use reduction planners, and that help companies with these challenges. So a company knocks on your door. How do you make the match with the substitution planner?
Well, we do not. What we do is we train professionals, including people from their own facilities. And as a small business, identifying the person who can put on an additional hat can be quite challenging, right? And that's what you're asking them to do, taking somebody from facilities or from engineering or from health and safety and adding to their skill set and their responsibilities. So we really encourage companies to find those people, those champions who want to learn about the process and bring it into the day-to-day business. And we also work with consulting professionals who see it as an opportunity to provide more services to their clients. So we don't make that match, but we help to train the bride and the groom to bring everything together.
Wonderful. Your executive director, Pam, Bashkut Tunjak, he once said to me, safer alternatives exist. And where they don't exist, they can be developed. So basically, a new broom sweeps clean. What tools and resources are available to support companies in identifying safer alternatives and/or substitution?
Well, there are a lot of tools that are out there. There are tools that help you to compare the relative hazard of chemicals that you may be considering. There are tools like our Cleaner Solutions database that has 20,000 different products that have been tested for performance for very specific conditions to demonstrate that a safer solution gives you what you need. But I think the toxic use reduction planning process itself is a tool, and it is that systematic approach to really looking at and questioning, do I need to continue to use this toxic chemical in the way that I do? Is there something that I can do to make my workplace safer, to make my product safer, to make the environment safer? Those are important tools, and the planners are one of the tools that we really encourage companies to take advantage of. But we also, as I've said, do a lot of research. We like to bring different stakeholders together to understand the problem more clearly. We do industry consortia planning or research. So that across the supply chain we understand where the challenges are, And we bring people to the table to help to really dive in and understand where their opportunities are. So those are all tools. But it is a process. It is a desire to make a change that I think really matters.
Beth, opportunities are important. Searching for safer alternatives is like speed dating. A broad search, fail fast, and they happily lived ever after. What criteria do you use to evaluate potential substitute for hazardous materials?
Yeah, so I think that the fail fast piece is really important. Criteria, we look at application, right? Because that's important. As we're thinking about the types of hazard that can be tolerated, obviously it's different if it's going into your lotion than if it's going into your battery, right? So, we think about application and hazard, or hazard and exposure, right? But then beyond that, and to the point about failing fast, we've set up, we're fortunate enough to have an in-house toxicology lab and also a group of predictive toxicologists in-house. And so, we use models that they have created and some that we've partnered with external organizations like ACS to develop to both search for safer solutions via, putting in the properties that you're looking for and then also bringing in the hazards that you're looking to avoid and narrowing down to a set of molecules that might work. And then we pair that with the predictive in-house models that we've created so that we can indeed fail fast. Because the last thing that you want is to spend a lot of time developing something and then, to your point earlier, end up finding out that it is not better than, or differently bad than something that it's replacing. So it's really important to be able to have these predictive tools that help you fail fast so that you don't spend a lot of time developing something and then ultimately it's not future-proof.
Thank you, Beth. Let's play devil's advocate. Industry always has high ambitions. How do you measure the actual success and impact of your safer materials strategy over time?
Yeah, so I think that there are a few ways to measure it. First, there are internal things like engagement in our R&D group around developing safer materials, interest in learning about toxicology principles, those kinds of things. So you can certainly measure engagement and interest in safer chemistry, right? Then there's the kind of, ESG reporting, tracking kind of stuff where, we'll put out a target around what our portfolio should look like and there will be progress against that target, right? But then, I think the most important measure is actually seeing growth in sustainable alternatives. We want our strategy to be a grow safer strategy. Because fundamentally, if we don't have that growth, if we aren't bringing in new, safer chemistry that is really succeeding in the market and where we're seeing growth, where there's not going to be progress against the goals, and there's also not going to be progress economically that we need to be a viable company.
So you measure growth by a bigger share of your products in that area.
Exactly. We want to see overall growth in sales, and within that overall growth in sales, we want that piece of the pie that is in the safest ones to be the highest and contributing an increasing portion.
So from a regular cake to a wedding cake.
Exactly. There you go.
Perfect.
Yum.
Pam, what role do stakeholders such as suppliers and customers play in the substitution process?
It's important. And I mentioned earlier that we do industry consortia research. That's where we're bringing suppliers together to share what their limitations might be. And it's all important information to help you move towards a safer solution. We have some research that's going on right now where we're working with unions because union workers who work in plumbing and work in painting are exposed to products that contain highly hazardous chemicals. So we are working with the unions and retailers and a small subset of manufacturers to raise awareness around what the concerns are, and to do the research, including making sure that the safer alternatives that may be developed give them the performance that they expect or that they can work with. But if it weren't for, in this case, the union employees saying, we want to have a safer workplace, we need to not be exposing ourselves to these carcinogens, there may not be as much of a push for that work. So whatever we're doing, we want to make sure that we're listening to as many stakeholders as possible and getting their feedback on where the opportunities lie and where the limitations lie. Those limitations are equally important pieces of information, right?
Okay.
Because we want to get to something that works and that will be adopted.
Sounds good. Beth, how do you involve stakeholders?
So customers are critical, obviously. I think, to your point, things can't succeed if, you aren't getting that pull down the value chain. And, regulators can restrict substances, or, NGOs and soccer moms can rail on substances, but when customers are asking you to replace something, that's when, the rubber hits the road. That's when the money, the growth, et cetera, are on the line. And so that is what is really important. And, so it gets to your point about collaboration and bringing the whole value chain together too, because it might be, like you referenced earlier, where performance is not worse, but different. Right. And so, having those conversations with customers, it will be really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Final question, how do regulatory requirements influence the development and adoption of safer materials and the need for substitution?
We have this paradigm where we have leading companies who really want to move forward and do the right thing, and they do that because they have an internal ethic. And we have a whole host of companies who really want to make sure that they're doing what they are required to do and still, be able to sell their products or whatever. The regulations set that bottom, that floor level. And it's really important because we don't want companies to be misbehaving. My experience over the years is that companies are less and less about trying to get away with something and more about trying to do the right thing and something that they can really work on and rely on for the long term. But regulations set that floor, and that's a really important driver for change. Our experience is that you set that kind of minimum level and you give them the tools to find innovative alternatives, and companies will go for it. Not everybody, but once you get a couple companies out there making a change, they can bring in others, demonstrate that it works, and that safer alternatives are really a very viable alternative for the future.
Thank you for sharing that. You're referring, of course, to the US federal and specifically the high bar of the Massachusetts regulations. Beth, you have a global role.
Yeah, and that's actually what was just going through my mind when you were talking about the regulatory floor, and I was thinking about, gosh, how from a global picture, the picture is just really different in different places around the world. And obviously, regulations do drive behavior, they do drive change. But when we see a global picture that can look so different in different places, there can be variability in that change. And you can end up with things like what I think the European Union is facing right now, which is companies leaving Europe because the regulatory picture is is fundamentally different in Europe than it is in many other places. And so, I think that from an industry standpoint, I would look for certain things from regulators. First of all, global consistency in terms of a risk-based but strong chemical management approach. And then, in order to be risk-based, you need to have data requirements and data sharing. And you touched on earlier the need to have, again, data to support that the solution is safer than what you're replacing. And I think, that's one of the things that regulators can really drive, is that there is data on what is out there and what is replacing things, so that we can all truly adopt safer solutions.
Perfect. Beth and Pam, thank you very much for sharing your lessons learned. I think it's safe to conclude you never get a second chance to make a first impression. But everyone deserves a second chance. But a second chance doesn't mean anything if you haven't learned from your first mistakes.
I love that. Thank you.